All right, so today in our 30 minutes-ish that we have left to talk about stuff, we're going to be talking about transnational feminist cultural studies, which most of the work that I do is in the field of transnational feminist cultural studies, in addition to a few other fields like Palestinian cultural studies and queer theory and some other stuff. So before we get into that, though, let's just talk about transnational feminism broadly as an activist and a scholarly endeavor. So transnational feminism is concerned with gender and identity broadly, and all transnational feminists approach gender and identity from an intersectional lens. So you can have lots of different feminist approaches to intersectionality, what we might describe as intersectional feminisms, right? Feminisms that deal with multiple systems of oppression at once. And our reading on multiracial feminism was just one example of a type of intersectional feminism. So multiracial feminism is one type of intersectional feminism, and transnational feminism is another type. And in particular, what transnational feminism does maybe differently than a lot of other sorts of feminism is that it locates everything that it does in a global, transnational world that allows it to be sensitive to differences of location and nation. In other words, multiracial feminism tells us that women experience sexism differently based off of their racial identity. Transnational feminism tells us that women experience sexism differently depending on where they live in the world, their nationality, or perhaps their ethnicity or citizenship. So it's concerned with globalization. It's also very concerned with the economics. So it's concerned with global capitalism, with neoliberalism, with these new economic practices and economic ideologies of the modern globalized era. Moreover, transnational feminisms on a cultural side are always critical of cultural imperialism and neo-colonization. And ultimately, transnational feminisms are focused on building divides, bridging divides, both activist divides and academic divides, to build collaborations, build solidarity between women located differently across the world. As a scholarly field, transnational feminism emerges as a critique at a very particular moment. So if you'll notice, right, a lot of people think that the biggest critiques of feminists are people who don't identify as feminists ideologically, right? But the reality is the biggest critiques of feminists are other feminists. As a field, as an academic field, we spend a lot of time revising and critiquing ourselves in order to adopt to new things that are changing in the world. So transnational feminism is a newer sort of feminism, one that really only started being kind of talked about in the late 80s and into the 90s and today, because it's focused on this global moment, this moment of increased globalization, decreased role of national borders, this increased movement of goods, peoples, ideas, cultural practices. And transnational feminism is really specifically critical of notions of universal sisterhood or global sisterhood that emerged in the global feminism field. Don't let me forget, before I let people go today, I got to talk about another extra credit opportunity later this month. So it's really good. So if we think, it's really concerned with critiquing this kind of global sisterhood approach. So if we think back to the multiracial feminism article, in that article, the authors talked about universal sisterhood. And universal sisterhood was this idea that all women, right, by virtue of being women, are all universally aligned and in solidarity by default because they all experience the same experience of living under sexism, right? Now, multiracial feminists came in and they were like, wait, hold on a second. Not all women experience sexism the same way. In fact, all women experience sexism in different ways from each other, and that's based off of their identities in systems of race, class, sexuality, etc., right? So from there we got multiracial feminism as a critique and revision of what feminism was doing at the same time period. Now, that says feminism, okay. And now what we're seeing is a similar sort of critique here when it comes to transnational feminism. So instead of universal sisterhood, we have global sisterhood. This idea that all women all around the world are in natural solidarity and alignment with one another because they are all affected in the same way by these sorts of global systems of sexism, right? And transnational feminists come in and say, hold on, we call bullshit. If you're a woman who's living in the global south, your concerns as a woman, the things that you need on a daily basis, the needs that aren't being met, your concerns are going to be very, very different than a woman who's living in the United States, right? So, for example, transnational feminists have drawn attention to how in the global south, women are a lot more concerned about health care, economic stability, right, sexual and reproductive health, support for child raising, whereas in the United States, a lot more kind of readily available and visible feminism is focused on women's representation in popular culture, right? Women's representation in movies, in magazines, in music videos, etc., right? So transnational feminists are coming in and saying, listen, the second we start talking about all women all over the world experiencing sexism the exact same way, then we open ourselves up to the possibility that assuming women in the global south are concerned with the same issues as women in the global north, and then what do we end up doing? We end up kind of politicking around that narrow set of issues that only applies to women in the north or in the west. So from here we get right? So from here we get transnational feminism. Now, moreover, transnational feminism isn't just critical of global feminism through its assumption of this global sisterhood, but it's also critical of international feminism for its reliance on the nation state as a unit of analysis. Now remember, we've talked about transnationalism as not being quite the same thing as globalization. Transnationalism involves the decreasing role, significance, power, influence, impact of the nation state, right, of the nation as where power exists and where power circulates and has its biggest effects. So international feminism is focused on this idea that different women in different countries are affected differently by sexism, right? But transnational feminism is really looking to kind of move away from the nation as a unit of analysis because of the fact that the nation has a decreased role in political, economic, and cultural affairs, and also because we have this possibility then that the second we start talking about Chinese women or about US women or about Brazilian women, that we have this tendency to then essentialize women from a single nation as universally oppressed, right? When we know that even within Brazil, different women are affected by sexism in different ways. Within the United States, women are affected by sexism in different ways. So transnational feminism is really about expanding an intersectional approach to include nation, location, ethnicity in its kind of confines, in its metric, without ever essentializing what those things might mean for different women. Now, a lot of different issues have interested transnational feminists, and some of the main ones that we've seen gain a lot of attention, I'm going to just blow through these really quickly, are global gender inequality having to do with legal rights and economic power, hegemonic gender norms being globalized, westernization and global imperialism, these two things we've talked a lot about, women's and human rights, neoliberalism and global capitalism, war and militarism, talking about the ways in which women are affected by war differently as the people who take care of their families and their children, women's health, sexual, reproductive in general, and then immigration and migration. And one of the articles we have for this week is focused particularly on thinking about migration, and another one is focused particularly on thinking about and teaching about neoliberalism and global capitalism in a gender studies classroom. So if we look specifically at this question of immigration, we can help understand better what transnational feminism offers us or reveals about gendered practices. So if we think about immigration, the various reasons people immigrate, the places they immigrate to, and where they are migrating from, we can think about these various things. So first off, our experiences of national, gendered, sexual, and other identities are wrapped up in processes of globalization, neoliberalism, and international exchange of various sorts. So how do we begin to explain that? Well, I can start with some personal example. So I consider myself and take a lot of pride in being somebody who's really well versed in a lot of different types of food and love to eat food from different restaurants that represent different places all over the world. And that is something that I can do in a globalized moment, right? That I can really build my own self-identity as being a cultured, educated, worldly, modern person around my experiences, right, of globalization through my consumption of various food products, right? So how we think of ourselves as national, gendered, sexual, and other beings oftentimes depends on or emerges in a global sort of context. Another thing that transnational feminist scholars of immigration have talked about is how immigrants and migrants live with multiple subjectivities as they navigate lives in both their new and home cultures, right? So does anybody here, and we've talked about this before, does anybody here come from a family that is recently migrated to the United States in the past couple generations? Yeah, a few folks here. So do you, Angel, I might ask you, do you have family gatherings where you perform your ethnicity or your identity differently than you do with maybe a group of friends here at the university who don't come from the same background?
Definitely.
Okay, what might be an example?
Just going to family gatherings, it's a lot more. I don't normally speak Spanish.
Uh-huh.
My Spanish isn't great when I go there, and then I start talking the way my family does because they're from Sinaloa, so it's a lot more slang involved in it.
Okay. And do you ever get that feeling that you're kind of living in two worlds, that you're never fully this with this group of people and you're never fully this with that group of people? For me, I'm never fully Palestinian with my Palestinian family. I'm always the American one. And then when I'm with my white friends, they're always we don't think of you as white. And I'm bro, I'm white first, but I get it. I'm that one friend that you have that has some connection, to some other place, right? But it's I'm never just fully taken as this thing, right? And this is one of the insights that people who've written about migration kind of offer, is that when you migrate, when you move to a different country, into a different sort of hegemonic culture, that you end up having to have multiple subjectivities that you turn on and turn off at different times, right? Additionally, histories of colonialism and global power imbalances structure modern experiences of globalization and movement. So if we think about immigration and migration and trends in migration, right, we will see overwhelmingly that most migration takes place from the global south to the global north, right? That there are these sorts of kind of channels of migration where people from particular countries tend to come to other countries and tend to come there for particular sorts of work, right? And then finally, what we've been able to conclude is that processes of globalization or transnationalism don't offer this sort of utopian, amazing, beautiful world where everything is free and open, right, and we can get anything, anytime, anywhere. But realistically, they actually oftentimes end up reinforcing systems of oppression. So how does culture then answer into this question? So everything that we kind of know about feminist approaches to culture can really, really help us think about this transnational moment in more detail. So things that we've already learned from this class are that culture is just as important as the economic or political realms when it comes to where power is exercised, right? That culture is a site of power both in terms of reinforcing and challenging systemic oppression. That culture is everywhere, we're always immersed in it, there's no outside of culture. That it's reconstructed through a range of practices. Cultures aren't essential, they're always changing. And that they're also really reconstructed through cultural imaginary spaces where we imagine some sort of shared connection to each other through our identities and cultures and discuss and debate what that means. Now, transnational feminist cultural studies picks up on all of these insights, but locates them in a transnational moment, right? We're always trying to evolve our scholarship to address how the political and economic realities of our world have changed, right? So it does to culture the same thing we saw done to immigration with transnational feminism. Basically, it makes culture about identity in a global or transnational moment, and it adds another layer or scale, or we might say context, for thinking about systemic oppression, culture, and also resistance as women begin to use cultural production and consumption to resist sexism in a transnational way. And we've already kind of gotten our feet a bit wet with that by talking about the article on crudas and transnational hip-hop feminisms, but this will go into a lot more detail. So TFCS is a framework or methodology for discussing cultural practices and identity in this global moment. Gillian Sandel, who's one of the largest writers on transnational feminism, refers to transnational feminist cultural studies as a methodology articulated through a series of essays by Interpol Gruhl and Karen Kaplan, who are two really foundational transnational feminist theorists, and that their essays analyze the social and political significance of cultural practices produced within the context of globalization, and that critically engage the category of the nation state, right? So transnational feminist cultural studies is saying, listen, the nation state is no longer relevant, it's no longer important, it's no longer the main site of power that affects women, and therefore when we look at the ways in which women are producing culture, right, in resistance to sexism, it's no longer useful to just talk about Chinese women's counterculture, right, or Brazilian women's counterculture, but instead we need to look at the ways in which how women form solidarity, how women articulate activist standpoints is emerging in a global moment where they're learning from other women all over the world about what they're doing and, engaging in activism accordingly. So this field, transnational feminist cultural studies, has brought attention to a lot of important topics, some of which we've already kind of talked about, but other ones that'll be important for this unit, which really focuses on, or this week, which really focuses on labor and theorizing about women's labor from a transnational feminist perspective. A lot of these things will be important. So the exclusion of women from global transnational processes parallel to their former exclusion from the nation state. So as the power of the nation state starts to be reduced and in exchange replaced with the power of things like the World Trade Organization, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, entities like this, we still see in those entities a significant misrepresentation or underrepresentation of women. Another thing we see is the unique position of women as laborers in the global chains of capitalist production. In other words, as globalization expands the ability for corporations to work in different places all over the world, those corporations typically rely on and oftentimes exploit women's labor in a number of different ways, paying them less, not covering comprehensive health care that relates to female-specific health issues, also preying on ideologies about women's complacency. So a lot of international corporations that run sweatshops all over the world like to hire women because they're seen as being more complacent and less likely to organize labor strikes to improve their working conditions. Next thing we see is the important role of cultural practices or production as a form of survival in the transnational moment, that women are using cultural practices in order to survive transnational changes that negatively affect them. And then also, more than just survival, these things are being used as a form of resistance in the transnational moment. So we can engage in this sort of analysis in our papers, for our final papers, for our reading reflections for this week, by engaging a number of different steps. So first off, we really want to think about the scope of the practice or the artifact we're dealing with to try and define it, who participates in it, and who it affects. Now you want to be attentive to the context of the practice. What year is it being practiced? Where and under what social, political, and economic conditions? So when we're talking about something like skin lighteners in this current moment, it's not enough to talk about women in India who are using skin lighteners. It's also important to talk about the fact that these skin lighteners are being produced largely by Western cosmetics corporations, right? Corporations that do not regulate what's in those products in the same way that they do in Europe, right, as they do in India or in the global south, making women in those regions more susceptible to a range of health issues. You need to think about this, right? And this means locating the practice in a global context. Is a practice influenced by factors not located where the practice is taking place? Does it involve people across a large distance in different places? Does it affect people removed from where the practice is taking place? As you begin in your reading reflections for this week, and for a lot of you on your papers as you're talking about practices that might be transnational, this is the sort of analysis that you want to engage in, right? So what's amazing about transnational feminist cultural studies is that it can help us reveal a lot about the world. So it helps us understand how concerns and ideas about gender and sexuality have a global scope. So here's just a few examples. Right now, one thing that we see is really common is the use of women's rights as a signal of development or progress, right? So oftentimes when you hear people talk about about the global south and different places in the global south being bad places, being backwards, being anachronistic, right? If we think about the logic of Orientalism, one thing that we see a lot is this idea that women's rights are a signal of development and progress, right? And that if you have a country that doesn't have the same sorts of rights for women as you see in Western democracies, that your country must be undeveloped in some sort of way. We see the same thing emerge with LGBT rights, right? That we talk about countries in the Middle East, for example, and justify military intervention in countries in the Middle East, oftentimes by talking about the ways in which gays are mistreated in those countries. For example, through the circulation of videos of ISIS throwing gay men off of roofs of buildings, right? We use that as a sign of underdevelopment, right? In a global arena, such that if you are a country in the global south who wants to begin to gain recognition on a cultural level as a modern place, you need to start bringing your women's rights and LGBT rights regimes up to the same level that Western democracies employ, right? Another thing we see more broadly is the use of rights narrative to justify war and intervention, right? That oftentimes you hear people say, well, we're going and invading this country in order to save the women there from being mistreated, right? And that oftentimes is used as a justification, right? That really depends on ideas about gender and ideas about women as being in need of saving by the sort of man on a horse swooping in at the last moment to save them, right? It helps us think about global media and communication channels for spreading ideas about gender and sexuality. It helps us think about the ways in which the people who operate these channels are typically men and typically are driven by profit, right? And we might also, this transnational feminism allows us to think about the cultural imperialism of Western hetero and homonormativity, gender norms, and racial hierarchies, which is what we talked about a lot over the past few weeks, as we've seen these Western racial hierarchies, Western gender norms, right, and Western sexual norms kind of implanted in places all over the world and enforced there. So this is, I know, kind of trying to move really quickly through this stuff, but I want to get done and get us out of here maybe a bit early. So transnational feminist cultural studies is also further important for thinking about the topic of this course, right? It challenges the notion of a clearly defined West or a clear category of Western culture, saying that those terms don't really offer us very much to think about, or they're not very useful and kind of precise and coherent terms for talking about culture and identity in the modern world, right? And it also suggests that feminist scholarly or activist agendas need to be attentive to disparities between women based on location, nationality, ethnicity, and citizenship, right? So what this means is that TFCS would be apprehensive about misrepresentation unless it's very strategic, preferring instead to be specific about how different contexts affect women differently. So what we're seeing then with transnational feminism is a move from generalization to specificity. And we can place that in the context of our discussions from the last unit to better understand how transnational cultural feminism or transnational feminist cultural studies offers kind of a counterpoint or offers a response to practices of cultural imperialism. Practices of cultural imperialism like to take one narrow, gendered practice, for example, and make that universal all over the world. Practices of cultural imperialism look to get rid of local, gendered practices, right? So when we were talking about fashion, we were talking about how the ways in which men are dressing all over the world are all starting to mirror the exact same aesthetic, with all these more local styles of dress beginning to disappear. Now, transnational feminist cultural studies pushes back against that, trying to move back towards this very kind of specific and context-based analysis of women in particular locations, dealing with how those locations affect them specifically. So for this unit, we have two different readings. They're both in your textbook, and they're one right after another in the book, so they should be easy to find. The first article, Global Woman, is an article about women's migration to do feminized labor, like house cleaning and nannying, within a moment of globalization and the restructuring of global and national economies. The authors identify and explain what they call a push-pull dynamic, where economic changes have pressured women in the global south, right, or pushed women in the global south out of the global south in pursuit of work, while changes in the economies in the global north have pulled women from the global south there to do this sorts of labor. Now, the authors criticize the assumption that This represents women's liberation, instead suggesting that it only allows upper-class white women to benefit, who are now able to leave their houses to go and work in the public sphere, while underpaid migrants do domestic and emotional labor. Now, the questions for this reading that you want to think is, what do you think the term feminized labor refers to? What does it include? What sorts of labor do you think of as traditionally feminized? How are domestic care workers mistreated in a global context? The article details a lot of the mistreatment of these workers. What creates the push-pull dynamic? Why are migrants being pushed out of their countries in the global south? Why are they being pulled to the global north to work particular jobs? And why is transnational feminist cultural studies applicable to this reading? The next article we have is called Anti-Globalization, Pedagogies, and Feminism. This article is a bit tough, and I want you to focus, well, here, I'll get there in a second. So Mohanty, the author, she deals with pedagogy. Pedagogy is a term for the philosophy of how to teach, right? It's about studying how to teach, how teaching can be effective. So, for example, I would prefer if this room was just flat with chairs, so I could arrange the chairs in circles to be able to facilitate discussion in a way that kind of puts everybody on the same level. That's something that comes out of pedagogy, right, and the philosophy of how to teach. So Mohanty deals with this and the ways in which women's studies or feminist studies programs like mine, like the one that you're taking this class in, are trying to internationalize or globalize their curriculum. And Mohanty identifies three main models used to approach this within the classroom, problematizing the first two and concluding that the third model, the feminist solidarity or comparative feminist studies model, is the best. So when you're reading this article, focus your energy on these 2 pages where Mohanty details these 3 different pedagogical models for globalizing a feminist curriculum. Now, at the end, Mohanty looks to make differences between women central to feminist analyses, and to think about ways to appreciate local differences in order to construct global solidarity across national and cultural borders. So the questions for this are, what are the feminists as tourists and feminists as explorer models, and why are they problematic? Those are the first 2 models that Mohanty says kind of suck. The next thing is, why does Mohanty want to think about anti-globalization instead of globalization? What's the justification? And finally, what's the importance of capitalism to Mohanty's discussion of women? Why does she make it so important for her to talk about? Now, we're at the end of the slideshow there, but I want to draw folks' attention to this really quickly. So on Saturday, April 21st, here at the university on campus, is going to be this Youth Social Justice and Ethnic Studies Symposium. It's a symposium put together by UA employees who work with high school and middle school students to put on a symposium that allows those students to talk about the various issues that they face in their community. So this is going to be organized as a series of panels throughout the day on Saturday. There's 4 time slots in the day, each of which has a couple panels that you can choose from, okay? And I'm going to have a small assignment prompt where you'll go there and go to 1 or more panels and then write about those panels in relationship to this course. Now, there are 4 panels throughout the day, okay? So I'm giving 2 different extra credit opportunities. For those of you who just want a tiny boost and just want a couple extra points to really make things safe and comfortable for you, you can come to 1 session of the 4 and write about any of the 1 sessions that you want to as it pertains to this course. For those of you who are looking to get more points, you can get up to 4 extra credit points by coming to the entire day's activities. In other words, you'll go to 4 panels and writing about those, okay? I will require people to sign up ahead of time, and I'm going to be here for this event because I'm helping to moderate a couple of the panels, so I will be around there for it and be able to see you there. For folks who have already submitted extra credit before with the LunaFest assignment, okay, I'm capping extra credit in the class at 5 points. So if you already got 3 points on the LunaFest assignment, just do the 1 session for 2 points because that's all you'll be able to get, okay? And that'll bring you up to the maximum of 5. For folks who haven't submitted any extra credit yet, which is most of you, I suggest go for the whole day and get those 4 points. 4 points is 4%, right? It's the same thing. It's almost half a letter grade. It's pretty significant. So I will have more information coming out about that. That is a Saturday the 21st. If I got the date wrong, it is that Saturday, okay? But I'm pretty sure that's the 21st. So put that on your calendars. I'll talk more about it in the coming weeks.